Welcome back to ＳիվիլNet. I'm Patrick Elliott. I'm joined today by Raffi Elliott, who's my brother, but also a freelance journalist who was just down in Kornidzor and got up yesterday. So Raffi, thanks for hopping on.
Thanks for having me on.
So as of recording this, there's been already upward of 63,000 Artsakh residents who have moved into Armenia. Can you tell us a little bit about what the scene was like down there? What have you noticed? Give us an idea of what's going on the ground.
Yeah, so depending on how much people estimate the population of Karabakh is, that's roughly 60% of the population now that's already left in less than 4 days. I actually got down there on Saturday, so the day before it opened. At that time, the Red Cross was allowed in for the first time to bring emergency supplies, and then we had to wait till the next day for them to come back with the most heavily wounded from the fighting between September 19 and 20. At least that's what we were told, although the ambulances did indeed return with the wounded and went right to hospitals in Goris and Yerevan. We immediately started noticing this flow of, somewhat beaten up cars with people on them with all kinds of belongings in the back. At first, we just assumed that these were people from the Kornidzor village, which was just beyond the checkpoint, and we thought it was just the local traffic, but the flow was just too long. There's just not that many people in Kornidzor. Anyway, so this stream of cars started out on Sunday and then just continued to increase in volume until it was this complete flow. The way it was set up, though, was that they had a triage tent run by the Red Cross right at the entrance of Kornidzor village. Cars and buses arriving out of Nagorno-Karabakh were expected to stop there, where they would be registered in the system, given some water and maybe some food, and then bussed down to Goris, where the main triage center was set up inside the Goris theater building. And that's essentially how things operated for the first 2.5 or so days. Although I heard that yesterday they actually closed that first triage tent in Kornidzor because the volume was just too high to handle. And they've now opened several different centers across southern Armenia, including in Goris, which was already there, as well as the town of Vaik and Vayotzor and a couple other places. When we're talking about this number, 65,000, it may potentially actually be more because so many people just started flowing through that some probably just slipped through the net, so to speak, and just drove all the way to Yerevan in one shot, often without an idea of where they were going to spend the night. In theory, the government had announced that they had prepared housing for 40,000 families all across Armenia. It seems, from what I've gathered, that they've begun some sort of contingency planning for this sort of eventual scenario back during the summer. I think Eric Hagopian mentioned on this podcast that USAID had been present scouting locations and things like that during the summer.
In January. And I actually had some friends up here. I didn't mention this on the podcast last time, but I had some friends who were invited in February by the UN to go down and kind of, so they were telling me excitedly that we think Lachin will open up, so we'll get a flow of refugees. They were invited down for 2 months to kind of scope things out and prepare. So
yeah, I mean, it's clear that this is a scenario that the government and obviously its international partners probably thought was a realistic possibility, and so in this case there was some planning involved beforehand. But regardless, at this point, the level of refugees just crossing the border every minute is just so high that it's a matter of time before they overwhelm emergency services personnel and the Red Cross. And let's not forget that a lot of these people have been working round the clock since before the Lachin corridor opened, setting up, preparing, and then dealing with this whole catastrophe. And of course, there's also an emotional toll on them as well. They are just as Armenian as you and I.
You probably have family members there as well.
Some of them likely have family members. So it's a matter of time until like the strain on the system becomes felt. But there's also been tremendous mobilization in civil society as well, both in terms of the diaspora and local organizations that have been trying as much as possible to fill in the gaps that the government and international organizations may not be capable of dealing with at first. You know, from the get-go, there were organizations there like All for Armenia, Kuirigs, and so on and so forth. Perhaps one of the more interesting observations I had while I was there was the presence of a number of Russian relokants, as they call them. These are the people who escaped the draft in Russia and moved to Armenia in order to avoid fighting in Ukraine. Many of these people, there's almost 80,000 Russians currently living in Armenia, and their community was also just as mobilized. They've been raising funds, they've been opening food banks and collecting clothes and donation. And these people have been coordinating the distribution of these donations in Goris. I've seen them there. It's pretty impressive.
Can you tell us in terms of preparedness on the government? I know you touched up on this. However, when you were there, does it seem organized? You know, is this half-assed, or are they genuinely prepared? Is this kind of done in a professional manner when the refugees are coming in? Are their needs being met? Tell us a little bit about that, because it's something that a lot of people are definitely wondering or worried about.
Look, in the Armenian context, as far as things being organized are concerned, I was fairly impressed with how well set up things had been when I was down there. I'm not, unfortunately, an expert on humanitarian issues or logistics to that point, so I can't comment on what I would have done better. It's just worth remembering that the Lachin corridor is essentially a 2-lane country road that winds up and down a bunch of mountains. It's not designed to carry this amount of traffic. And by the way, most of the Lachin corridor that these people are driving on right now was actually rebuilt by the Azeris last year, when it was rebuilt to bypass the village of Aghavno and Lachin. So the quality is what it is. I've seen pictures of parts of the road starting to crack under the weight of all the vehicles. And the reality also is that there is also a flow problem coming on from the other side, from the Artsakh side. Because essentially, as I said, the first day was supposed to be for evacuating the wounded. By the second day, it was about evacuating those who most needed it. And then later it would have been a more of a organized and phased evacuation. Although in practice it didn't quite happen that way. By the first day of the evacuation, the Russians facilitated the transfer of all of those people who had initially fled from the villages along the Azeri front line on September 19th. These are the ones who fled either under fire and by foot, or they were evacuated by Russian peacekeepers to the Russian peacekeeper base. So if you've seen those kind of iconic photographs now of the tarmac full of people sleeping on it, these are those people. So they basically had nothing because they left as soon as the fighting started. They just bolted out of their homes and took nothing with them. So evacuating them was a priority, and they were they were among the majority of people who left on the first day. But after that, the Russians had promised them that anybody with a car would be allowed to leave, which essentially prompted a free-for-all on the Artsakh side. And this is kind of being exasperated by the fact that Artsakh is kind of suffering from a collapse of state apparatus at the moment. As the country, I mean, from what I've understood, just the area inside and a few kilometers out of Stepanakert is currently still under the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic's control. The Azeris have had encircled a number of population centers like Martakert and Martuni and so on and so forth, until the Russians and the Red Cross came in and evacuated everybody from those places. And once they were out, the Azeris got in. So there's not much left in terms of a state to facilitate an evacuation from the other side. So it's much more chaotic.
We've heard rumors that, first of all, there's a lot of elements of the Defense Army who haven't yet surrendered or have refused to do so. It's unclear as of recording this if the Azeris are allowing for fighting aged males to leave Artsakh unmolested. As of recording this, of course, yesterday we got the news of the arrest of Ruben Vartanyan, although on the other hand you had someone like Samvel Babayan who participated in the First War, who was an important opposition figure who made it unscathed to Armenia. So do you have any clarifications or any clarity or any ideas about whether or not men are allowed to leave Artsakh, or is it, what are the demographics of the refugees looking like mostly right now? Women and children, men as well, full families?
So I can't speak to the rumors of continued resistance inside Artsakh. I mean, at least I can't speak from personal experience. I do know that I saw people of both sexes, of all ages, crossing the border, including entire families, older men, younger men, teenaged boys. However, there were definitely fewer of them than there were women and children. Now, that could simply be that many of the men stayed behind to help with the evacuation. It could be that for reasons of public health or humanitarian necessity, they just evacuated the women and children first. That would also be true, by the way, of the people who were evacuated out of the villages, because the men were probably out fighting, and so they were not evacuated with their families. So they would probably have to follow later. Yeah, I mean, as you just mentioned, yesterday, Ruben Vartanyan was abducted by Azeri forces while he was trying to leave. It's really unclear why, because as far as we know, he was not involved in any war crimes. Of course, it's just Azerbaijan trying to humiliate him. That's really the only thing that makes any sense. I've seen pictures of Alexandrian, who was the deputy minister of foreign affairs, who, although she is a woman, she crossed the border with her family. So it's really hard to say. What I heard from people who crossed, and I've seen many what you'd call fighting age men who have crossed, and I spoke to some of them. Obviously, many of them were afraid of suffering the same fate as Ruben Vartanyan, but what they told me is that whenever they would reach that illegal checkpoint on the Hakkari bridge, the Azeris filmed everybody in the bus, got the men to go out, check their passports, put them back on the bus, and let them go. In some cases, maybe they made them say Nagorno-Karabakh is Azerbaijan or something like that, but they were not particularly endangered, other than, the general scenario.
Can you tell us about some of the stories that the refugees have shared with you? Or were you able to speak to some of them? Were they willing to share what they witnessed, what they saw?
Yeah, I spoke to dozens of refugees, again, of all ages and from different parts. One such refugee was actually originally born in Armenia, but had been living and working in a village in Karabakh for years. And his village is in between Stepanakert and Shushi, so it's kind of right under the cliff. So it's in full view of the Azeris. And he says that the bombings on September 19th started at around 1 o'clock when the children were in school, and that all the men in the village rushed to the school to try to get their kids out, and then the Azeri spotters saw this, and they redirected their artillery onto the school, and some 4 kids were injured, and some of the parents as well. Luckily, by some miracle, there were no deaths, at least that he knows of. For all we don't know what the situation ends up being. Others told me a story about having fled into the forest near their village, and then waiting it out, or hoping to wait it out until they would get rescued by the peacekeepers, because many people had been told to shelter in place until the peacekeepers came. And then these people were also targeted by Azeri fire. Several of them were killed, while the other ones essentially escaped on foot until the other valley, where they were eventually picked up and brought to the Russian peacekeeping base. I also saw, and I posted these photos online if anyone wants to check. But I've seen cars that had visible battle damage on them. One of them, at least two of them, seemed to have been strafed through the windshield by someone with a machine gun.
So they were deliberately shooting at civilian vehicles, from what you can tell.
At civilian vehicles, yeah.
As of recording this, so far Armenia has received millions of dollars in aid for this crisis. Obviously, it's not enough, but I suspect in the coming days there will be more. But from the EU, Sweden, the United Nations, the United States, France, Germany, and from our Russian partners, only condemnations of the government. What's the mood? If any of them brought it up, what's the mood amongst the refugees towards Russia, the Russian peacekeepers? Has anyone voiced anything in that regard?
Yeah, there was unanimous condemnation of Russia's action by everybody there. Everybody who spoke to me told me that they felt betrayed. They only returned after 2020. Keep in mind, some of these people are already on the third or even fourth exodus from their homes in their lifetimes. And many of them had only returned in 2020 because they were told that Russian power in the region was so to be feared that they would be safe. And they felt betrayed by the fact that they were, the Russians basically stood aside. But with that said, many of them also talked about the individual acts that Russian peacekeepers were involved in terms of pulling them out of very dangerous situations, often coming under fire themselves. Others told me that their interactions with individual peacekeepers, again, like throughout the blockade and so on, was generally quite sympathetic. Many of them were thankful, again, for the fact that they were evacuated when they were. I've also seen many Russian peacekeeping convoys driving into the Lachin corridor since it opened, and many of them were packed with bags of flour and things like that. So they've definitely been involved in some way in providing immediate humanitarian aid. They've also been involved in the evacuation of those who were the burn victims from the petrol station explosion, which happened on Monday. Russian helicopters were able to evacuate several dozen people from Stepanakert overwhelmed hospital. So while we haven't heard any news of Russia providing humanitarian aid inside Armenia per se, currently Russia and the International Committee of the Red Cross are the only two organizations that had been given some sort of access to Nagorno-Karabakh. So they have been involved over there, as far as I know.
Yeah, the closest historical parallel I can think of in this case would be like the rape of Nanking, where the German, at the time, of course, the German ambassador was a card-carrying Nazi, ended up saving as many Chinese as he could, despite direct orders from Berlin and despite being an allied country to the Japanese.
Yeah, I mean, the difference is that there were tens of thousands of German soldiers standing nearby doing nothing. Yeah,
I just mean that from we do have reports of individual actions of Russians who let's say have maintained their humanity throughout and been able to do some good, and we owe them a debt of gratitude for that.
I mean, it's just important to say that these are 18-year-olds who are just trying to do their jobs.
Conscripts.
And no, they're not conscripts actually. They're professionals. Yeah. Because they're part of a unit in the Russian army that is sort of specially trained for peacekeeping operations. But they do not have a mandate in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Azerbaijanis refused to sign the mandate as of 2020, and they still haven't signed it. So they also don't have like clear rules of engagement. So while you could say that Russia has been complicit in this entire scenario that's unfolding, the peacekeepers themselves were never really in a real position to act. They didn't have the orders. They don't have the numbers. They were in the few cases in which they tried to do something, they were hoping that it was just enough to show the flag, and in some cases it was. Now it just wasn't. as you know, I think maybe half a dozen Russian peacekeepers were actually shot by the Azeris during the fighting in circumstances that are quite murky.
Yeah. Thanks again for joining us on ＳիվիլՆեթ, and Raffi, thanks for reporting from Kornidzor.
Of course. Thanks for having me.